Hello, my name is Stephen. I'm from Statesboro, Georgia. And first of all, I'd like to say what a great blessing your ministry has been to myself and my friends and family. And so I have some friends, and we really enjoy the polemics of Christianity. We like to sit around and talk. I think there's a lack of a great love for that in the church beyond argumentation, you understand. And we'd like to invite you over sometime and spend hours just talking with you. So. But I had a question I wanted to ask because I think maybe there's, even in this audience, a lot of people that are in this position, and I wanted to make a distinction. And Michael talked about a person with insincere faith, or maybe a lack of faith, or a person who had never been converted or saved. But I wanted you to comment on a distinction, and I phrased the question like this. What is the nature of the hope of professing Christians who have indeed experienced God in the past, but are presently experiencing a lull or a hiding of God's face? Can a difference between this and a true loss of faith be articulated? And you kind of, in the scriptures, maybe the psalmist who says, "How long, O Lord, will you hide your face?" Jesus from the cross who says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Or maybe two disciples on the road to Emmaus who say, "We thought it was him who is going to restore the kingdom." Can those men be men of faith? And what would you say to a believer who's suffering that kind of situation?
Do you want to take that, Michael?
I think there's an important point to be made here. The question, as you phrase it, is to do with feeling. How close you feel God is, that sense of relationship with Him. The point I was making in my talk was that first and foremost, faith is a response to a God who is real and true. In other words, you can't let your feelings dictate what the truth of the situation is when it comes to this. You have to let the truth really ultimately dictate to your feelings, which is what obviously the psalmist does when he's crying out, "Awaken my soul within me," and so on. I think the writer who I know who's best described what you're talking about is a guy called C.S. Lewis. And I'm sure you're familiar with his book, The Screwtape Letters, where in that book, if you're not familiar with it, it's a story about a senior devil in hell writing to a junior devil on earth, giving him some advice about how best to make people's life a misery. And one of them is on precisely this issue. And what he says is, look, he's writing to this junior devil saying, look, don't be excited right now that the person you're looking after feels that God is distant from them. Okay, that's not a cause for celebration. Because he said, have you never heard of the law of undulation? He said, which is that these human beings, although their hearts are in eternity, that's where the source of their hope is, they live through a passage of time while they're here. And it goes up and down. He says, and when they're going down through the down, don't think necessarily that they're letting go of God. It may be that during that time, they may ultimately come closest to Him. When the Apostle Paul was writing to the Corinthians, he said, and it's very interesting he said this because he's writing a letter to defend his leadership. People accusing him of being weak, that he's not a strong enough Christian to be a leader, whereas they're very strong, they don't have any problems, so they should reject Paul as their leader and embrace these other super apostles. And he says, you heard that I had some troubles in Asia. He says, I don't want you to be uninformed, my brothers, about the trouble I had in Asia. He said, it went so deep that I despaired of life itself. Now, I've read that statement many times, and I've often thought about it. To me, it sounds almost suicidal. He's writing a letter to defend his leadership to a church who think he isn't strong enough. And he starts off at the very beginning by saying, you heard I had difficulty in Asia. Let me tell you how difficult it was. I despaired of life itself. And then he says, but in this I rejoice. Now, have you ever read that about if you're familiar with the Christian faith where Paul talks about rejoicing in suffering, have you ever wondered why he talks about that? I mean, was he sort of slightly mentally disturbed? He saw suffering coming, he saw pain coming, he saw depression coming, and he went, whoo, pain. I love pain. God, thank you for sending me this great trial. He doesn't rejoice in the tribulation that he's going through for the sake of it. He rejoices because he knows what ultimately may be produced by it. He says, yet in all of this I'm able to rejoice, for this taught me to trust not in myself nor in anyone else, but only in Him. In other words, everything else was stripped away. Everything was taken from him. He despaired of life itself. But the one thing that remained, the one hope he still had after all of that had been taken away, was Christ. And so, if you're here and you're in that situation where you once knew that Christ was near, yet he now seems far, what you have to remember is that your hope is secure. Now, if he's far because you've turned away from him, you just need to turn. If you're seeking for him and yet he still seems far, then don't despair. Because C.S. Lewis makes the observation that the Christians who've served him the greatest have gone through down deeper, darker and longer troughs than anyone else, yet come up the other side shining for him. Now, what I was saying in my talk was that there are some people who have never known that. Not who once knew and now have lost it, but have never known. And you can't lose what you never had. And so at some point you have to ask yourself the question, do I feel like this because this is something I never knew and I'm actually looking for it? I was with a man last week and we talked for hours. I said, I don't think you're a Christian. I've never seen a man look so relieved in my whole life. He said, oh, I'm so glad you said that. I've been trying to be one for 35 years and this is it. I'm not interested. So we talked a bit more and then he said, can we talk some more? I'd like to find out. For him, the step to getting to the truth was to realize for the first time that even though he'd been born, raised and gone to church every single Sunday of the year. And that was the start of discovery. But for the one who once knew, who's lost it, you're now in a different situation. It either can be because you've turned from him, or it simply may be that you're going through a trough, everything's been stripped away, just like it was for the Apostle Paul. And one day you will shine very brightly for him. And that's a source for hope, and it's in that that Paul rejoiced.
I've been given the signal that we've got 2 minutes to go. And we just told a couple minutes and we have to wind down. So the other questions that are here, here's what we're going to do. Questions that have been unanswered, I'm going to suggest we have them in writing. Michael and I will sit in front of a microphone, put it all together at the end of the CD, and you'll have that for you. For the gentleman who asked that, Steve, was that your name? You just up here a minute ago? Yep. I recommend the book by Os Guinness called God in the Dark. It's an excellent book that I think you will find as he is wrestling with these very questions, how it is that he emerges from the scene of doubting. My suggestion is this: there's a difference between doubting and questioning. When you question your faith, you take one step back. When you doubt, you want to take all the steps back as if nothing in it, as if you don't believe anything anymore. Questioning your faith is a common thing if you want to put heart and mind together. Doubting it is another thing. If you're in doubt, then you've got some serious questions about the person and the work of Christ. If you've got a question, then you're dealing with the peripheral issues of how it's explained. Let me give you one parable and we'll close. It's a Jewish parable of Elijah going with the rabbi into a home, a very poor family that had a cow that was very thin, miserable. But this poor family entertained him for the night, gave him bread and milk and butter and all. And in the morning as he was leaving, one of the walls collapsed out there and the prophet moved on. They stay in a rich man's house the next night and he gives them all the fat of the land and so on. And before he leaves, Elijah has a wall rebuilt for him and walks away. The rabbi says, I don't understand it. We're that poor man. He fed us all they had. And in the morning we wake up, that wall collapses and you walk away. Here we're at a rich man's home. He gives you so much and you rebuild a wall for him. He said, yes. It was decreed that next day that he was going to lose his wife. And I interceded and God answered by preserving his wife. He was going to lose the wall. Together they would rebuild the wall. The rich man lived with his greed. His wall was breaking down and he was going to rebuild it himself. But behind that broken wall was a huge pot of gold. And if he'd rebuilt it himself, he'd have found that pot of gold. Now I've rebuilt it. He won't go beyond it. He will never find it. And God has settled the balance so that he won't go after the riches any more than he should. When you look at that, think of the contingencies of life. There are so many things in life we don't know. When we meet him face to face, we'll find out why some walls fell and some walls were rebuilt. And there was an eternal purpose to it. Time is a speck in the sea of eternity. and God explains it all. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for organizing this.